Hello everybody, welcome back to Education for Diversity in Secondary Education. Today we're going to be talking about understanding and supporting behaviour in young people and thinking about the traditional ways that this has been done and some alternatives. We'll be going on to talk about this in the workshops as well this week. As always, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of this beautiful land that nourishes us, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues engaging with this presentation. I'd just like to make another acknowledgement to Zinnia Mavawalla, who's a colleague of mine. She's currently in Strathclyde at the moment, but Zinnia and I work very closely and together as well with Michaela Vergano and David Patterson on the inclusive education approach at the University of Canberra, and Zinnia and I have worked together on this presentation and many others. So thanks to Zinnia as well. The aims of today's session are to start exploring what good behaviour means, what strategies adults and particularly teachers use to manage behaviour in young people, and the consequences of different strategies to manage behaviour. There are two things I want to say first of all. Sometimes I think that when we give these lectures, people assume that we think kids should just be allowed to get away with anything. That's not the intention at all. Even kids can be abusive, and they need to be guided around behaviour. And we'll go on to talk much more about that in the tutorial on Wednesday. The second thing that I want to say is that all of what I do again here is based on evidence from research about the consequences of particular approaches to managing behaviour. Just bear that in mind as we go through the PowerPoint. There are some sensitive issues in this lecture. If you do find that anything you hear or read about makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable or unhappy, please do contact these services. Canberra University Counselling Service is free and available to all currently enrolled students. And then there is the Blue Knot helpline with all the details available there. So once again, this lecture is going to be a provocation to get us all thinking about things deeply, and perhaps things we don't always think about, or perhaps things we could think about from a different perspective. So you'll need a pen and paper again. And I'd like you to spend 5 minutes just reflecting and making some notes and remembering behaviour management strategies that were used by teachers on or with you when you were a child in primary or secondary school. I'd like you to think about what the impact of the strategy was. How did it make you feel about yourself? Did it impact on the way you felt about the teacher? And did it actually have any impact on your behaviour as a young person, whether that was the behaviour that the teacher was trying to encourage, or perhaps it had a different effect? And then I would like you to think about whether you would use this strategy. Why and why not? So quite a lot to think about there. Do spend 5 or perhaps more minutes going through that slide. Okay, so today we'll be thinking about what we mean by behaviour, and in particular what we think of when we talk about good and bad behaviours. So let's start that by asking you to pause the recording and take a minute to write down all the words that you associate with good behaviour. Please continue with this slide after a minute, so I'll leave the slide up and I will start talking again in 1 minute. Okay, off you go. Okay, so often in schools nowadays, teachers euphemistically refer to behaviours. They say things like, we've got a few behaviours in this school, by which they mean behaviours that they, the teachers, find challenging. And it's very interesting in schools that the students who are most disliked by teachers are often not the ones who are most violent, for example, towards other children. Or they're not even the ones who are cruel to animals, not the ones who appear to do the least work. But they are the students who most directly challenge the adults, the teachers. And I wonder if any of you chose a word like compliant when you were thinking about what good behaviour is. And I wonder if you thought perhaps, or something around the idea of doing what adults ask you to do. Those kind of behaviours that go along with people. But are there sometimes good reasons for not going along with other people? Are there sometimes good reasons for challenging adults? There are times when adults have things to hide. Times when their behaviour is inappropriate, harmful, utterly abhorrent. And at those times, the compliance of the child is essential to that adult's ability to engage in these behaviours with no consequences to themselves. And we know that complying with these requests, if you're a child, in these circumstances can have long-term, lifelong consequences for some people. So perhaps a request for silence from an adult in an abusive relationship. And we can think that children should somehow know when it's appropriate to follow the instructions of adults and when it's not appropriate. We could tell children, for example, that they should be compliant perhaps with their teachers and other family members, such as uncles or aunts or grandparents, but not with strangers. But I hope you can see straight away that that is certainly not a foolproof way of getting desirable compliance. And there are actually no rules that we can give to children that would make it absolutely clear how to differentiate when and when not to be compliant. We don't have those rules, in fact, even in adult society. look at the current arguments around whistleblowing, for example. Where do we stand on speaking out if war crimes have been committed? So if it comes to your knowledge, perhaps you work for the Defence Department, comes to your knowledge that Australians have been committing war crimes, what do you do in those circumstances? Do you go along with your department that tells you to not say things, or perhaps a superior officer who tells you not, a superior worker who tells you not to say things? Or do you bring it to light? Where do we stand on electoral fraud? Even as adults, we struggle to make these rules work for us. So how can we expect children to know when it is and when it is not appropriate to be compliant, when it is appropriate to do what an adult tells you and when it just isn't? And again, it's not just in situations with adults that compliance may not be ideal. Sometimes those situations involve other children. So for example, where harm and pain is being caused to someone, and several students are complying with requests to do what someone else tells them, even if they feel uncomfortable. Perhaps they comply because they are fearful of the consequences if they don't comply. I'm actually going to read this slide because it's so powerful, and it shows again that these situations of compliance being good behaviour aren't restricted to children. And Porter says, whole communities become unsafe when people do as they're told. The defence of most perpetrators of genocide is that they were only following orders. And Porter says that more crimes against humanity have been committed in the name of obedience than out of rebellion. And an example of that is the Milgram experiment. Now, I'd like you to watch this video about the Milgram experiment. There is a link to this in the modules tab for this week, in case you can't pick it up. Unfortunately, I can't embed it in the PowerPoint. It is about 8 minutes long, I think, something like that. I would like you to watch the whole thing. Okay, so that video is actually pretty terrifying. Against the expectations of psychologists, 65%, 2 out of 3 people that you meet would shock you, even if, until you're in intense pain, even if you are, you had a heart condition or something like that. And even if it caused them discomfort, even if they were not comfortable with what they were doing, that, they felt that it was wrong and they just didn't want to do it, they still would do it because they want to be compliant. And this is what they've been told to do for most of their lives. It's what we've all been told to do for most of our lives. The difficult thing is that you don't know who the 2 out of 3 might be. And psychologists have looked at this and they don't seem to be able to work out who, for example, in Guantanamo Bay, who would have been torturing the prisoners and who would blow the whistle. And note here that whether or not you agree with the practice of torture, the issue here is whether ordinary people have the right to know that it's happening. So in all these cases, whether you think war crimes are okay or not, the issue is, do the Australian people have the right to know about that? But so the important thing here is psychologists don't know who will comply and who will refuse to comply. What they do know, according to Dungan and colleagues, is that prioritising constructive dissent within an organisation can actually discourage whistleblowing. So if you encourage people to constructively say, I'm not completely happy with what's happening here, or maybe we should do this way, do things this way, or something like that, then actually they don't feel the need to go and tell everybody else what's happening, because they feel that they will be listened to within their organisation and so on. So what I want to do now is think about what teachers do, what happens in schools that contributes to the way that ordinary people respond to authority, as they did in Milgram's experiment. And in the workshop later, we're going to look at what we could do as teachers to contribute to a different way that people might respond to authority. So let's look at some really common practices in schools for dealing with those behaviours that teachers feel are undesirable. Now, one of the most common of those is timeout, and sending students often out of the classroom, or certainly away from an activity. And Marowska and Sanders, excuse me, in 2011, wrote an article on parental use of timeout, and we're asking, is it useful or harmful as a parenting strategy? Now, this obviously is in relation to parents, but like I say, timeout is a very regularly used strategy within schools. And Marowska and Sanders concluded that there are some circumstances when it really is not appropriate to use timeout. And those, for example, if a child is frightened or distressed or something, absolutely not appropriate to use it there. They state that there are 3 situations in which it is appropriate. If there is physical aggression, if safety is an issue, so for example, a child is persistently running out or something like that, or when the use of parental reinforcers is ineffective because somebody else is doing something that is encouraging the behaviour, and that is overwhelming the adult's attempts to move beyond the behaviour. But another thing that they explained is that it's absolutely not a strategy that you can use as a standalone thing. You have to be using some other positive behaviour strategies at the same time as using timeout, or you know, not absolutely at the same time, but within that kind of same time frame kind of thing. So as I said, they did feel that there are potential advantages, and particularly when it provides an angry child or an upset child with some time to calm themselves down. And I know actually I have in my life of my teaching life, my teaching career, sent a child out on one occasion, and that was because that child was giggling so much and they just couldn't get a grip. And as a giggler myself, I completely understand those situations, and I find that the only way that I can, you know, kind of get a grip is to get away from the people that made me laugh in the first place and just go somewhere else and just have a bit of quiet time or laugh it out of myself or whatever. But obviously, if you're so angry that you're not managing to communicate with people, then sometimes the best thing to do is give, according to Marowska and Sanders, is give students some time out to calm themselves. huge risks with timeout, and particularly timeout that is not used in the way that we've just discussed, for example, to allow you to calm yourself down, and it's not communicated to the child in that way. So, for example, if you're just sending a child out because they won't stop talking or something like that. And the risks with timeout are several. Firstly, timeout has to be seen by the child as less desirable than the activity that she or he is supposed to be doing. So, for example, my son, my younger son, first got sent out when he was about 6. And because he was so young, he was sent to another classroom. He was taught in an outside classroom, and he was sent to another classroom because he was too young to stand outside in the cold by himself. And the first time he got sent out, he was absolutely mortified. He cried and cried. The second time, he was also quite upset. The third time, it didn't really matter quite so much at all. And eventually, he became very comfortable with it, and he said to me one day, "It's great getting sent out, Mum. Now I've got friends in year 1, 2 and 3. So he actually discovered that timeout was quite a fun thing to do. You could go and make some friends in some other classes, and even if you got sent just outside the classroom, there would be people passing by, or you could stare out the windows and look at what the kangaroos are doing or what's going on the road or whatever the situation is. So, as it says, if it allows children to escape a setting or a task they dislike, it's not going to reduce misbehaviour, as Porter calls it. And the other difficulty is, even if you're having fun when you get out, you do miss out on teaching. And many of the students who get sent out are frequently the students who are struggling a little bit with learning in the first place. And indeed, that might be why they're presenting behaviours that teachers find challenging. The very fact that they are struggling with the work. So you send them out and they'll have even more struggles next time they try to do it, and they'll also have negative associations with that particular activity as well. Now, that wasn't the case with my son, but what was the case was that he got repeatedly sent out, and it made absolutely no difference to his behaviour, which is the third point. The strategy is not effective if it doesn't change the behaviour. So you need to start thinking of an alternative at that stage, and preferably, a bit before it. It really shouldn't be something that is used often. So one of the questions that this provokes is there a difference between time out and chill out time? So maybe what we're saying is sometimes students are just beside themselves and they may need to go and just chill out, just get out of the situation, calm themselves down. It's different from time out as a punishment. And there's also that thing about time in. Sometimes it can be better to give a child a little bit of extra attention. So, for example, helping them with the work that they're doing before they get to the stage of behaviours which the teacher views as undesirable developing. So, time in might be an option, or if they're feeling distressed, and that distress comes out in a kind of angry presentation, then maybe the best thing is to get the time in before that develops into something more challenging for the teacher. Okay, so in 2015, Payne reported on a study of a range of strategies to encourage desirable behaviours and constructive behaviours. And they found that the findings were very complex, in fact. Some sanctions for class behaviour do encourage pupils to stay quiet, but actually those sanctions also complicated the student's ability to engage in discussion when necessary. So, for example, if you are giving sanctions to students who you think are asking silly questions or disrupting the class in particular ways, the likelihood is that they stop engaging in the learning activities, particularly those that involve, for example, Socratic discussion or critical thinking discussions, because they become uncertain about which questions are not appropriate, which are appropriate, and self-conscious about their mode of asking questions. So, for example, they might shout things out. Some children, when they get overexcited about a learning issue, shout things out, and then there are sanctions for that. Obviously, we want to help students to develop the behaviours that are more productive and don't involve shouting things out, but by giving them sanctions for doing so, it is counterproductive to their engagement in discussion. Giving pupils detention or asking them to miss break, unfortunately, those are counterproductive, and the evidence was done in this study and has been shown in other studies. Rewards, such as giving, the good work stamps or whatever, smiley faces and that, work well in helping students to like a particular teacher, but they don't actually change work behaviours. They don't promote hard work, and especially not in older pupils such as you'll have in secondary schools. The incentive of the school reward trip, universally effective. So if you say there will be a reward for you if you work hard, in the short term, students will work harder for that. Payne also says, as is contact with home. Now, I in my experience, both as a parent and a teacher, it actually depends on the qualitative nature of that contact with home. I know that as a parent, when you go through periods where all the contact that you have with the school is negative, you as a parent can end up complaining about the school in front of your children, and that can be a very have a negative impact on your child's approach to their work. So that contact with home needs to be balanced quality contact, not always just ringing up about your child's done this today, but real positive, constructive contact with home. But there is a downside to rewards and punishments anyway, and that is the effects that rewards and punishments have on the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation of students. Now, intrinsic motivation, if you're not familiar with it, is you wanting to do something because you want to do it. Extrinsic motivation is when you are motivated to do something because somebody else is going to notice and either praise you or give you some form of reward. So Hannes and Fox did an experiment where they gamified the curriculum. Now, I don't mean here that they made a game, like a board game of the Russian Revolution or anything like that. That's a different kind of gaming, and teachers do use that in schools. But what I mean by gamifying the classroom or the curriculum is using the things that make a game motivating and enticing to achieve another goal. So you're not necessarily playing a game. what you might be doing is what growing legions of educators across the country are doing, which is bringing game dynamics such as points, leaderboards, badges into the classroom. But John Spencer suggests, John Spencer is a teacher and education writer, and he suggests, excuse me, that the danger is with this, that we may be signalling to students that learning in itself is not inherently meaningful. So we're kind of taking away their intrinsic motivation to learn and make it an extrinsic motivation. You're only going to learn because you're going to get a badge. And many educators feel it's a kind of Pavlov's dog's response to students. To teaching students. It's just a kind of crude method of getting a Pavlovian response. Yes, it might have short-term gains, but the novelty soon wears off, and you might need to offer ever bigger rewards to students to keep their interest. And I do remember when I was at school, my colleague was explaining the reward. I was new to the school, and my colleague was explaining the reward system that a particular boy had for his behaviour, and she was showing me his sort of star chart, saying, well, he got a sticker for this, and when he got a sticker, he got whatever. And she said very cynically, because I think she was not entirely happy about this, and she said, and if he did this, whatever good behaviour it was, I don't know, we probably gave him a bike or something. And so that whole thing of, you know, just those rewards just getting bigger and bigger and bigger in order to keep the students' interest in the game. And the thing to remember about games is people usually play games that they have some interest in the first place. So no amount of points and badges are likely to make you spend your hours playing chess if you hate the game in the first place. So remember, students have to be in school for hour upon hour, day after day. And so it's perhaps no surprise that the students in Hannison Fox's research, the ones who were on the gamified course, actually ultimately showed less motivation than those who were not on a gamified course, and they got lower final exam scores, probably because of the lower motivation. So that intrinsic extrinsic motivation thing is very closely tied to rewards and punishments, and there's a whole psychological literature on this. And there's another, possibly more sinister result in a way, in that gaming strategy focuses students on what they will get out of a particular behaviour, but it doesn't teach them that the behaviour itself is inherently desirable because of the impact it might have on other people. It doesn't help them in any way think what the impact of their actions is likely to be on other people. It's all focused on myself. What will I get if I do this particular thing? What will I get if I don't do that thing? What will the sanction be? It's all about me. Okay, so coercion, a closely related strategy really to rewards and sanctions. Now, the purpose of coercion is quite simply to get people to do what you want. And in the old days, in the old-fashioned ways, this might be done with the threat of harsh words or keeping people in infringement of liberty or physical punishments, corporal punishment in schools. Nowadays, it's more likely to be done sort of subtly and quietly by withholding acceptance and approval which you and other people have trained children to depend on, or by making the children feel that some retribution awaits them in the future. It's too vague to imagine what it might be, but they're not going to escape it. And Plato actually had a comment on this, which was that no trace of slavery ought to mix with the studies of the freeborn man. No study pursued under compulsion remains rooted in the memory. So what Plato is saying here is that coercing students to learn, to behave in a particular way, actually trying to coerce them actually goes directly against our very purposes our very purpose as educators, which is to help people learn. And looking at this last point, really coercion is about controlling other people, and it can be quite a vicious circle. When we want to control other people, students and whatever, and there will always be someone that you can't control. In fact, most people can't be controlled all of the time. Even the most compliant students have their off days. We actually start to blame them. There's something wrong with them. And we get more and more intent on coercing them. Or we just let our own fears about what will happen to us if the children don't do what we want, and what's going to happen. This situation is going to get completely out of control, and we let that reach out and infect the students. So there are quite a few downsides to coercion. And so to our final common practice, which is suspension and exclusion. And these responses are extremely ineffective in the long term. In the short term, kind of gets rid of the problem in that the teacher doesn't have to deal with the student who's not in the classroom. But in the long term, it does absolutely nothing to change behaviour. So out of school suspensions rise dramatically in late primary, early secondary years. And Mendes did longitudinal research. And longitudinal means it went over a period of time. And followed a cohort of 8,174 students in 150 schools through from kindergarten to graduation in Florida. And the research looked at race, gender, socioeconomic status, and special education classification to see if they could work out predictors of student suspension rates and the effect of the long-term effect of suspension on educational achievement and so on. And the data set included things like student surveys, teacher surveys, demographic information, standardized test scores, and suspension records. What did the research find? Well, probably no surprise to anyone who listens to the news or knows anything much about the history of the social history of students in education. Over 2/3 of poor, and by poor I mean students who were receiving free or a reduced price lunch, over 2/3 of poor black males receiving special education were suspended in 6th grade. Over 2/3 of poor black males receiving special education were suspended in 6th grade. And the pattern continued. Poor black males identified as receiving special education were more likely to be suspended at all and much more likely to be repeatedly suspended. This kind of went, well, the greatest predictor for suspensions in grade 6 was that the student had been suspended in grade 4 and 5, and this continues. The more they were suspended in grade 6, the greater the likelihood of suspension in grade 7 and grade 8. And Mendes notes that Proponents of out-of-school suspension frequently argue that these kind of so-called get tough policies, including zero tolerance policies, make schools safer and create a better learning climate. But clearly, whatever suspensions are doing, they are most definitely not providing academic benefit or behavioural deterrence to the students who are suspended or to the non-suspended students. And in addition to poverty and race impacting on suspension rates, so does exposure to family violence at home. So children who have been exposed to family violence, in this study by Alice Loomis in 2020, published just this year, children exposed to more family violence are more likely to disrupt classrooms, they're more likely to exhibit disruptive behaviours, and they're more likely to be suspended as a result. Okay, now you might think that the research that I've been talking about, some of it's a few years ago, some of it is, most of it is in the US. You might think that doesn't happen here in Australia. We have a much more egalitarian society. We don't have the extremes of poverty that you see in the US. We don't have the same issues around racial relations and so on. Students are not racialized to the same extent, you know, and the issues around disabilities just wouldn't happen here. Well, Hyde in 2017 found that all those issues are just the same in the Australian context. And these groups of students that you see here in this list are disproportionately likely to be suspended and excluded from school. So boys, poor students from poor economic backgrounds, Indigenous students, students with a disability of some kind, students who are exposed to drug use, display aggressive behaviour, and are struggling in school, particularly with the literacy aspects of school. These are the students who are far more likely to get suspended in Australia today. So we have a situation here where students who start on the suspension pathway continue on that pathway. There's no change to the behaviour. We have a situation where students who are, for some reason, not part of the dominant successful culture in our society are disproportionately likely to follow that route from suspension, repeated suspension to exclusion. And surely that can't be our aim as teachers, to say, well, those kids who come from different backgrounds, in some cases difficult backgrounds, those kids who struggle with literacy, those kids who you know, have been exposed to drug use or family violence, it's just their bad luck that they got born into that sort of situation, and as long as we don't have them in our classrooms, we don't really care. Surely that's not our purpose as educators. Surely when we're, whatever practice we are looking at, whatever practice we are advocating, it should benefit all children. But in the case of suspension and exclusion, we might want to think, well, who does benefit from this? One thing that somebody said to me last year is suspension can sometimes just give the teacher and the student a break from each other, and particularly give the teacher a break. And teaching is a difficult job. I am absolutely the first to say that teachers should be given more support in their practice. But is this suspension route and exclusion route really the best way to improve relationships between teachers and children? Is it the best way to improve the likelihood of students changing their behaviour? Is it the best way of creating a better learning environment for the students left behind, the ones who are not excluded? Well, Graham in 2014 says the difficulty with this suspension and exclusion route is that when the child who's suspended, the main protagonist, leaves the classroom, that leaves the teacher with no incentive to modify the curriculum, to improve our own instructional behaviour, or to address exclusionary school cultures. So you're just going to get kids from those same backgrounds coming into your classroom next year and the year after and the year after with the same results. Nothing's going to change unless we are challenged to think about the needs of every child. And secondly, one thing that beginner teachers don't always realise is that the removal of the most difficult student, if we want to use those terms, can sometimes just highlight the students who haven't been the main protagonist in the past, but whose behaviour just ramps up when that person leaves. So school and classroom-based factors that work to alienate students will continue to alienate students. And they don't get questioned and they don't get addressed if you just get rid of one student. So it's not benefiting anybody. And here's another important outcome of suspension and exclusion from schools. There is an identified link, an identified pathway, if you like, that many researchers have identified, which starts with students being sent out of the class, goes through detention, they get isolated, they start having to learn in different parts of the school on their own. They get temporarily excluded from schools, and then they go into permanent exclusion. And again, here's these statistics about excluded pupils being much more likely to have special needs. And from there, they frequently go towards prison. So many students who are in prison, young students in prison, have followed this pathway. And therefore it comes as no surprise that poor black children with learning difficulties are more likely to find themselves in prison. And there's lots of research done on it, and there's lots of research about the kind of feelings and self-concept that students get when they are first told that they don't belong in that classroom. And that kind of sense of being excluded, what the impact of that is on them. And eventually it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They don't belong in society. And therefore what they're going to do is reject that society and move towards prison. Of course, this is not, it's not a determining thing. It's not in the sense that it's not definitive that if you have ever been sent out of class, you will end up in prison. But it is a predictor for ending up in prison. This is a known pathway. Okay, I'll just let you read this slide. One of the issues for students who frequently do get suspended is this feeling that they don't belong, as I've mentioned, and that can be communicated in many different ways. They perceive that they're treated less fairly than the smart kids, as this particular boy, Ben, explains. And he says, you know, we're all fine as long as we just stick together, but as soon as we talk to one of the smart kids in the class, the teachers don't like that. You know, it's almost like, don't rub you onto any of them. And while that seems quite dramatic, all this constant don't distract so-and-so, don't, you know, that is something that does get communicated in schools. And there is another issue, a bigger issue here to think about. Some students are very school able or schoolable. And they get to do what they want to do and what they enjoy doing all day long, 5 days a week, for 39 or whatever weeks a year. Some kids are not so school able. It doesn't mean they're not able in other ways, but they're not so able in this context that they have to spend every single day in 5 days a week throughout the year. And you can understand why in itself that might seem a little bit unfair, that some kids get to do what they're good at and what they enjoy all the time, whereas some kids just get to struggle all the time. And so there's no wonder that some of these children feel that life is a little bit unfair. Okay, I hope I've given you some things to think about there. As I say, again, what I do is look at the evidence, look at the papers, the research that's been done, the results of that, when I'm approaching any educational intervention or practice. So I have based what I've said on the existing research in relation to these issues. We'll go on in the tutorial to talk about some other ways that we can constructively support behaviour and support students to achieve constructive outcomes in school situations. In the meantime, this is a nearly 58-minute video, and I'm not going to ask you to watch it, but if you do want to get some more ideas around behaviour in inclusive classrooms, by all means go and have a little look at that video. It starts about 3 minutes into it. The first 3 minutes is just an introduction. All right, I think we've got a references slide next, but otherwise I will see you on Wednesday.